Tommy Grayson had always enjoyed the solitude of trucking, the long stretches of highway, the peaceful quiet of the night, and the sense of freedom that came with being out on the open road. It was the perfect life for a man who didn't need much. That was until he got a call to haul a load through a deserted highway known as the Highway of the Damned. Tommy had heard the stories: truckers disappearing, ghostly sightings, and strange phenomena that had no logical explanation. But those were just stories, right? It was a good-paying job, and Tommy wasn't about to pass it up because of a few urban legends. He packed his truck, fueled up, and hit the road just as the sun began to set. The first few hours passed without incident, and Tommy began to think the stories were nothing but tall tales. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The air felt heavier, the darkness seemed to press in on him, and the highway stretched on endlessly, with no signs of life. Not a single car had passed him, not even a distant set of headlights. It was as if the world had fallen away, and he was the only person left. And then, out of the darkness, he saw it. A small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. Relief washed over Tommy. He hadn't seen anything resembling civilization for hours, and the idea of a hot meal and a break from the road was too tempting to pass up. He pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching under his tires. The diner looked old, its windows grimy, and the neon sign buzzed with a low hum. But there were lights inside, and that was enough for Tommy. He pushed open the door, a bell jangling overhead as he stepped inside. The place was empty, save for a lone waitress standing behind the counter, her back turned to him. "Just coffee," Tommy said, taking a seat at the counter. The waitress didn't respond. She stood there motionless, her back still turned. Miss?" Tommy called, a little louder this time. Slowly, the waitress turned around, and when Tommy saw her face, his blood ran cold. The waitress's face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark and hollow. She stared at Tommy with an intensity that made his skin crawl. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Coffee?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Tommy swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Yeah, coffee's fine." The waitress turned away, moving slowly, almost mechanically, as she poured the coffee. Tommy's mind raced. Something wasn't right about this place, about this woman. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. It was as if some unseen force was keeping him there, trapping him in the diner. The waitress placed the cup of coffee in front of him, her eyes never leaving his face. Tommy hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the cup. The coffee was black, thick, and had a strange smell to it. "You're not from around here, are you?" the waitress asked, her voice low and eerie. Tommy shook his head. "Just passing through." The waitress nodded, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Most don't make it through." Tommy's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The waitress didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her eyes dark and empty. Tommy's hands shook as he sipped the coffee, the bitter liquid burning his throat. Suddenly, the door to the diner swung open, and a cold gust of wind swept through the room. Tommy turned to see a man standing in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Tommy's heart raced. "What's going on? Who are you?" The man stepped forward, his face still obscured by the darkness. "This place, it's not what it seems." Tommy stood up, his legs shaking. "I'm leaving." The man shook his head. "You can't leave. Not now. Not ever." Tommy's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean I can't leave?" The man stepped closer, his face finally coming into view. His skin was pale, his eyes dark and empty, much like the waitress's. "This highway, it's cursed. Once you stop, you're trapped, just like the rest of us." Tommy's heart pounded in his chest. "Trapped? That's ridiculous. I'm getting out of here." The man shook his head, his expression grim. "There's no way out. Not for you. Not for any of us." Tommy's hands shook as he backed towards the door. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, a hallucination. But everything felt too real. "I don't believe you," Tommy said, his voice trembling. The man's face twisted into a sad smile. "You will." Tommy turned and bolted out the door, his heart racing as he sprinted towards his truck. He jumped into the cab, slamming the door behind him and starting the engine. The truck roared to life and Tommy floored the gas, desperate to get as far away from that diner as possible. But as he sped down the highway, something strange began to happen. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no end in sight. The same trees, the same signs, the same bends in the road kept repeating as if he were driving in circles. Panic set in as Tommy realized the truth. He wasn't getting out. He was trapped, just like the man had said. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, a low, eerie voice whispering through the static. "You can't escape, Tommy. You're one of us now." Tommy's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he sped down the endless highway. The voice on the radio continued to whisper, filling the cab with an unsettling presence. It spoke of the damned souls trapped on the highway, of the inescapable fate that awaited him. "You can't run, Tommy. There's no way out." Tommy's heart raced as he turned off the radio, trying to block out the voice. But even with the radio off, the voice continued echoing in his mind. "You're one of us now." Tommy shook his head, his breath coming in short gasps. He couldn't accept it. There had to be a way out, some way to escape this nightmare. Tommy sped down the highway, but no matter how far he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. The trees on either side of the road blurred into dark masses, and the road stretched endlessly before him, an infinite path to nowhere. His eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, expecting to see something chasing him, but all he saw was darkness, until it wasn't. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer at an impossible speed. Panic gripped Tommy as the lights grew brighter, almost blinding him in the mirror. He pressed harder on the gas, the engine roaring in protest, but the lights continued to gain on him. A blaring horn sounded behind him, and Tommy's heart leaped into his throat. He looked over his shoulder, his hands shaking on the wheel. What he saw made his blood run cold. Behind him was a massive 18-wheeler, its headlights blazing, barreling toward him at full speed. But there was no driver in the cab, just an empty, ghostly rig hurtling down the highway, intent on running him off the road. Tommy swerved, trying to keep control of the truck, but the ghost rig was relentless. It honked again, the sound like a monstrous wail that echoed in his ears. "Get away from me," Tommy screamed, his voice cracking. The ghost truck veered closer, its horn blaring louder, filling Tommy's mind with terror. He could feel the heat of the engine behind him, smell the burning rubber as the truck closed in. Just as Tommy thought it would smash into him, the ghost rig swerved suddenly, passing by with inches to spare. But as it sped past, Tommy saw something that made his heart nearly stop. There, sitting in the cab of the rig, was a figure dressed in a trucker's uniform, his face twisted into a grotesque grin, eyes burning with a supernatural glow. Tommy screamed again, yanking the wheel to the side. His truck skidded off the road, bouncing violently over the rough terrain before finally coming to a halt in a ditch. For a few moments, Tommy just sat there, panting, his heart pounding in his chest. He was alive, but only just. The ghost rig had disappeared, but the terror remained, seeping into his bones. He knew now that there was no escaping this highway. No matter how far or how fast he drove, it would never let him go. Tommy's breathing was ragged as he climbed out of the truck, his legs shaking beneath him. His body was battered, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse. He looked around, but there was no sign of the ghost rig or the diner. The highway stretched out before him, empty and desolate, as if the events of the night had never happened. But Tommy knew better. He could feel the presence of the highway like a living entity watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. With no other options, Tommy climbed back into his truck. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the mirrors, expecting to see the ghostly truck return at any moment. But the highway was silent. For hours, Tommy drove, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. He passed the same trees, the same signs over and over, as if the road was looping endlessly. There was no escape. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Tommy's exhaustion finally caught up with him. His eyelids grew heavy, and despite the terror that gripped him, he couldn't fight the overwhelming need to sleep. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road and leaned back in his seat, his mind swimming in a fog of exhaustion and fear. But just as his eyes began to close, he heard it, a voice, low, eerie, and unmistakable. "You can't leave." Tommy's eyes snapped open, and he looked in the rearview mirror. There, in the back of his truck, was the same ghostly figure he had seen in the rig. Its eyes burned with the sickening glow, and its twisted grin sent shivers down his spine. Tommy screamed, his hand fumbling for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was getting closer, its grin widening, its hand reaching out for him. "You're one of us now," the figure whispered. Tommy's world went black. He woke up sometime later, but when he opened his eyes, everything had changed. The highway was gone, the trees were gone, and so was his truck. He was standing in the middle of an empty road, the sky a sickly gray above him. The ghostly figure stood before him, its grin still twisted and malevolent. "Welcome to the highway of the damned," it said. Tommy's heart sank as he realized the truth. He was no longer a trucker on the open road. He was now a part of the cursed highway, just another lost soul trapped in an endless nightmare. He would drive forever, just like the others, and no one would ever know where he had gone. David Mason had been trucking for over 20 years, and he'd seen his fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared him for the night he took the job along Highway 13, an infamous stretch of road cutting through the heart of America. Legend had it that many truckers had disappeared on this highway, and most avoided it like the plague. David, however, was not superstitious. To him, it was just another road. And when he got a high-paying job hauling a shipment of electronics through the night along Highway 13, he jumped at the chance. The night started off like any other. The hum of the engine, the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt, and the glowing moonlight overhead set the tone. But as the hours ticked by, the road grew darker, more isolated. David's radio crackled with static, unable to pick up any stations, and his phone had long since lost signal. He drove on in silence, his eyes scanning the dark road ahead. That's when he saw him. A lone figure standing on the side of the road, waving his arms for help. David's heart sank. No trucker wanted to stop in the middle of nowhere, especially on a highway with such a sinister reputation. But something about the man seemed desperate. Against his better judgment, David slowed the truck and rolled down the window. "Need some help?" David asked, keeping his voice steady. The man nodded, his face pale and gaunt in the moonlight. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible. "I've been stranded out here for hours." David hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep driving, but he couldn't just leave the man out there alone. "Get in," he finally said. As the stranger climbed into the cab, David noticed the coldness that seemed to cling to him, like the night air had seeped into his very bones. The man didn't say much at first, and David found himself glancing nervously at him from time to time. "Where are you headed?" David asked, trying to make conversation. The man stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the dark road. "Anywhere but here," he whispered. As they drove deeper into the night, an unsettling tension filled the cab. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The stranger's silence was unnerving, and the air inside the truck seemed to grow colder with every passing mile. David glanced at the stranger again, noticing how his clothes seemed worn, like they had been through hell. His eyes were hollow, his skin unnaturally pale, and his hands were trembling. "You all right?" David asked, his voice laced with concern. The man didn't respond for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "You should have kept driving," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. David's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The man turned to him, his eyes dark and sunken. "There are things out here. Things that shouldn't exist. And once they find you, they don't let go." David felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to laugh it off. "Come on, man. You're not telling me you believe in those old ghost stories, are you?" The man didn't smile. "I'm telling you that you're in danger. We both are." David's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't want to believe the stranger, but there was something about the man's tone, his eyes, that made it impossible to dismiss. His heart raced as he pressed harder on the gas, desperate to get off Highway 13 as quickly as possible. But no matter how fast he drove, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The moon hung high in the sky, but the darkness around them felt oppressive, suffocating. And then, out of nowhere, the truck's headlights flickered. "What the hell?" David muttered, his eyes narrowing as the lights blinked once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the highway into pitch black. Panic seized David as the truck coasted along in total darkness. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the massive rig came to a halt. His hands trembled as he reached for the flashlight he kept in the glove compartment. The stranger beside him was unnervingly calm. "It's here," the man whispered. David ignored him, stepping out of the truck with the flashlight in hand. He walked around to the front of the vehicle, his heart pounding in his chest. The engine was fine, the battery intact, but the headlights refused to turn back on. And then he heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. He slowly turned around, the flashlight beam cutting through the night, but there was no one there. Just the open road and the endless expanse of desert beyond. "Get back in the truck," the stranger shouted from the cab, his voice sharp with fear. David didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted back to the cab, slamming the door behind him. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Drive!" he shouted. David didn't argue. He slammed his foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward as the engine roared to life. But as they sped down the highway, David saw something in his rearview mirror, something that made his blood run cold. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, was running after them. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, and it was gaining on them fast. "What the hell is that?" David shouted, his heart racing. The stranger shook his head, his face ashen. "It's not human. It never was." David's hand shook as he floored the gas, the truck barreling down the highway at breakneck speed. But no matter how fast they went, the figure kept gaining on them, its twisted form growing larger in the rearview mirror. The truck was pushed to its limits, the engine roaring as they sped down the desolate highway. David's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure behind them seemed to grow closer with every second, its grotesque form illuminated by the faint moonlight. "What do we do?" David shouted, his voice thick with panic. The stranger beside him didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. His face was pale, his body rigid with fear. "It's too late," he whispered. David's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The stranger shook his head. "Once it finds you, it never stops. It'll follow us to the ends of the earth if it has to." David's mind raced, his thoughts jumbled in a mix of fear and confusion. He had no idea what was chasing them or why, but he knew one thing for sure: they had to get away. Suddenly, the figure behind them vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the desert night. David blinked, his heart still racing. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger nodded, his face grim. "It's not gone. It's just waiting." David's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Ghosts? Monsters? Curses? It all seemed too unreal, but the fear in the stranger's voice was real enough. And whatever had been chasing them, it had been real too. Hours passed, and the tension in the cab was thick enough to cut with a knife. The highway stretched endlessly before them, the moon casting long shadows across the desert. David kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing them again. But the road behind them remained empty. "You think we lost it?" David asked, his voice shaky. The stranger didn't respond. He was staring out the window, his eyes distant, as if lost in thought. Finally, he spoke. "It's never really gone. Once it marks you, it's only a matter of time." David's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The man turned to him, his expression grim. "I've been running from it for years. It catches up eventually. Always." David didn't know what to say. He had no idea what kind of nightmare he'd gotten himself into, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stick around to find out what happened when it caught up to them. "We need to find somewhere to hide," David said, his voice filled with determination. The stranger shook his head. "There's no hiding from it." David ignored him, his mind racing as he scanned the dark horizon for any sign of civilization. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of desert stretching out in every direction. And then, up ahead, he saw it. A small, run-down motel, its neon sign flickering in the distance. "We'll stop there," David said, his voice filled with hope. The truck pulled into the parking lot of the rundown motel, its headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt and broken windows. David killed the engine, his hands shaking as he stepped out of the cab. The stranger followed him, his eyes darting nervously around the empty lot. "This won't stop it," he warned. David ignored him, his heart pounding in his chest. He was desperate for a reprieve, even if it was only temporary. He pushed open the door to the motel lobby, the bell above the door jangling as they entered. The place was deserted. The air was thick with dust, and the furniture was old and worn. David approached the front desk, ringing the bell for service. After a few moments, a frail old man appeared from the back room, his eyes tired and dull. "Need a room?" the old man asked, his voice raspy. David nodded. "Yeah, 2 rooms, please." The old man gave him a strange look, as if he could sense the fear radiating off them. But he didn't ask any questions. He handed over 2 keys, and David quickly made his way to the room. Once inside, David collapsed onto the bed, his body exhausted from the night's events. The stranger stood by the window, his eyes scanning the parking lot outside. "It's not over," the stranger said quietly. David didn't respond. He didn't want to think about what might happen next. All he wanted was a few hours of peace, a few hours where he didn't have to worry about whatever was chasing them. But as the hours ticked by, David found it impossible to relax. Every creak, every gust of wind sent his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them. And then, just before dawn, he heard it, the sound of footsteps outside his door. David's blood ran cold. He slowly got up from the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He crept towards the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the knob. He opened the door a crack, peeking out into the hallway, and that's when he saw it. The figure, standing at the end of the hall, its twisted form silhouetted against the dim light of the motel's flickering sign. David's breath caught in his throat. It had found them. The stranger appeared behind him, his face pale with fear. "We need to go," he whispered. But David couldn't move. He was frozen in place, his eyes locked on the figure at the end of the hall. It started to move towards them, its grotesque form gliding silently across the floor. "Now!" the stranger shouted, grabbing David's arm and pulling him back into the room. David stumbled, his heart racing as they barricaded the door with whatever furniture they could find. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The thing outside wasn't human. It didn't follow the rules of the living. And sure enough, the door began to rattle. The figure was trying to get in. "We're trapped," David whispered, his voice filled with despair. The stranger shook his head. "We keep driving, we don't stop. Ever." David's mind raced with the implications. He had survived the night, but for how long? The shadow wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. And David knew deep down that it would never stop. Not until it had claimed them both. Gary had been a trucker for over 15 years. He was used to long, lonely drives through desolate highways, weaving through mountain ranges, and navigating winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. His current route took him through the heart of the Nevada desert, a stretch of highway notorious for its isolation. It was supposed to be a routine trip: pick up the load, drive through the night, and deliver it by dawn. But as the sun began to set and the shadows of the mountains lengthened, Gary had an unsettling feeling in his gut. Something about this trip felt off. His radio had been acting up for the past few hours, only emitting static or faint whispers of voices that he couldn't quite make out. He'd chalked it up to the desert's interference with the signal, but it didn't make him any less uneasy. Around midnight, the desert seemed to come alive. The wind howled outside, whipping up the sand and dust, making visibility difficult. The headlights of his rig cut through the swirling dust, but the vast emptiness beyond the road was impenetrable. Suddenly, something darted across the road. Gary slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. The truck skidded to a stop and he stared out into the dark desert. There was nothing there. No animal, no person, nothing. But he could have sworn he saw something. With a deep breath, he shook his head and pulled back onto the road, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But as the night wore on, the unease gnawed at him. Around 2 a.m., Gary spotted something up ahead. A figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated by his headlights. It was a man waving his arms, clearly trying to flag him down. Instinctively, Gary slowed the truck. He wasn't one to pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of the night, but there was something desperate about this man's actions. As he pulled up next to him, Gary rolled down his window. "You okay?" he asked. The man's face was pale, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes wide with fear. "Please, you have to help me," the man begged. "Something's after me." Gary frowned. "What do you mean? What's after you?" The man's eyes darted nervously to the darkness behind him. "I don't know what it is, but it's been following me for miles. Please, just get me out of here." Against his better judgment, Gary unlocked the passenger door. "Get in." The man climbed in, looking over his shoulder the entire time. As soon as the door was shut, Gary pulled back onto the road. "What's your name?" Gary asked. "Michael," the man replied, still glancing nervously out the window. Gary wanted to ask more questions, but something in Michael's demeanor told him not to push. They drove in silence for the next few miles, the tension in the cab thickening with every passing minute. Then out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life. "Help me. Please. Help me." Gary and Michael both froze, staring at the radio as the voice repeated its eerie plea. "What the hell is that?" Gary muttered, reaching for the dial to turn it off, but the voice continued. "Help me. It's coming. It's coming for me." Michael's face drained of color. "That's the voice. That's what I heard before it started following me." Gary's hand shook as he tried to shut the radio off, but no matter what he did, the voice kept echoing through the cab. The temperature seemed to drop, and Gary could see his breath in the cold air. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw it. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light, was standing in the middle of the road directly behind the truck. Gary's foot slammed on the accelerator, his heart pounding in his chest. The truck roared down the highway, but no matter how fast he went, the shadowy figure seemed to keep pace, growing closer with every passing second. "What is that thing?" Gary shouted, glancing at Michael, who was curled up in his seat, terror written across his face. "I don't know," Michael cried. "It's been following me for days." Gary clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The shadow was closer now, almost as if it were floating behind the truck, its form shifting and distorting like a black cloud. The headlights of the truck barely illuminated it, but it was unmistakably human in shape. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Gary demanded, his voice thick with fear. Michael shook his head, his hands trembling. I thought I could outrun it." Gary's eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The figure was only feet away now, and the cab of the truck was growing colder, the windows fogging up with frost. Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered. Gary's heart skipped a beat as the vehicle slowed, despite his foot pressing hard on the gas. The shadowy figure was almost at the back of the truck now, its dark, twisted face barely visible in the side mirror. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. Gary blinked in confusion. The truck roared back to life, and the warmth returned to the cab. He glanced over at Michael, who was sitting upright again, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Is it gone?" Gary asked, his voice shaky. Michael nodded slowly. "For now." The two men drove in silence for the next hour, both too shaken to speak. The highway stretched endlessly before them, the desert on either side, an empty expanse of nothingness. Finally, Gary broke the silence. "What the hell is going on? What was that thing?" Michael swallowed hard, his eyes distant. "I don't know exactly, but I've heard stories. Legends, really, about a creature, something ancient, that stalks the desert. It targets travelers, follows them, feeds off their fear. Once it marks you, it doesn't stop until it has you." Gary's stomach twisted. "And how did you get marked?" Michael hesitated, staring out the window at the passing darkness. "I don't know. I was on a trip, same as you. Driving through the desert late at night. I picked up a woman. She was stranded on the side of the road. I thought I was doing her a favor, but something wasn't right. She kept looking behind us like she was scared of something, and then she vanished." "Vanished?" Gary asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, just disappeared into thin air. After that, the shadow started following me." Gary's hands tightened on the wheel. "So what now? Is it going to keep following us?" Michael shook his head. "I don't know, but I've been running for days and it's never stopped." Gary's mind raced. He didn't know what to believe. Ghost stories, curses, it all seemed too unreal. But the fear in Michael's voice was real enough, and the shadow, whatever it was, had been real too. Hours passed, and dawn was beginning to break on the horizon. The first hints of sunlight spilled across the desert, casting long shadows across the highway. Gary had hoped that daylight would bring some relief, that the creature, whatever it was, would retreat with the coming of the sun. But his hopes were quickly dashed when the radio crackled to life again. "Help me. It's coming. It's coming for me." Gary's stomach dropped. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was. The shadowy figure, clearer than ever in the light of the early morning, was floating behind the truck once more. "Jesus Christ," Gary whispered. "It's back." Michael turned in his seat, his face pale with fear. "We have to keep going. We can't stop." The truck roared down the highway, but no matter how fast they went, the shadow kept pace. Gary's heart raced as the figure drew closer and closer. It was only a few feet away now, its twisted face almost pressed against the back of the truck. Gary slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the truck to its limits. The engine roared in protest, but the shadow wouldn't stop. Suddenly, the truck lurched violently, and Gary fought to keep it on the road. The tires screeched as the vehicle swerved, and for a brief moment, Gary thought they were going to crash. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The truck slowed, and Gary pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he killed the engine. Gary and Michael sat in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The desert was quiet again, the sun now fully risen and casting warm light over the barren landscape. "It's gone," Gary whispered, unable to believe it. Michael shook his head. "Number, it's not gone. It's waiting. It always comes back." Gary stared at him, dread filling his chest. "Then what do we do?" Michael's face was grim as he looked out at the empty desert. "We keep driving. We don't stop. Ever." Gary's mind raced with the implications. He had survived the night, but for how long? The shadow wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. And Gary knew, deep down, that it would never stop. Not until it had claimed them both.